Thanks, Yuri, for the opportunity to let me present here. I'll present on what's called quantified self. I work a lot with what's called also digital health, which is considered somewhat a broader subject. But I'm part of this movement, which is quantified self. It's now about, say, 20,000 people. It might be bigger. Some are signed up at meetups like this. You see there's 113 groups, 19 cities, 31 countries. So it's a big global movement of people interested in the same subjects, which can be related to things like below neuroscience, personal informatics, tracking your health, but also much broader subjects, maybe tracking productivity or other things. Quantified self is what it makes it different from digital health. Quantified self is a community, and in this community we present and we experiment and we do a lot of science, which is called NS1, so a little experiment which is mostly about you, and then maybe you want to scale. And we ask 3 questions. What did you do? How did you do it? And what did you learn? That doesn't have to be technological at all. It can be anything. It can be pencil and paper. It can be some project that you can just talk about and therefore think it through. But that is the basic idea of quantified self. What is the goal? Kevin Gelly at one of the last global conferences illustrated like this. This is a North Pole. North Pole is a sort of a device which you can wear around your ankle or somewhere else, and it has 8 internal buzzers which allow you to sense where north is. If you are wearing this device for a longer period of time, you start to develop a real sense of where the north is, even with the device not actively buzzing all the time, because you start to develop this sort of internal extra sort of sixth sense, you may call it. That is what a lot of quantified self people are also looking into. How can we develop new senses, things we cannot measure, cannot feel, cannot experience right now, but maybe we can use or leverage technologies or other things to make it happen. A big concept behind that is what's called the feedback loop. So you go from evidence on the top right to relevance, consequence, action, and all the way through. Yuri just said there's shorter feedback loops all the time. If you once get into the concept of what a feedback loop is, you can actually try and identify it in many different places. It's not specifically tied to anything health related. It's a much broader subject. Go into literature, you'll find many examples. But this is the concept. So you do something, thereof follows something else, and then it actually sort of goes on eternally through this. This is quite a big slide. I'll just leave it here. I'll post my slides later on so you can read through it. But there's been little research so far which really says something about the growth of this movement, how much people are really self-tracking. The image on the right is for a reason. It's somebody said, who's really self-tracking? Well, everybody who wants to fit in their skinny jeans. You can actually call anyone in a skinny jeans who wants to try and fit in their skinny jeans a self-tracker, if that is their mental model of sort of getting to a goal. It doesn't have to be technological at all, like I said. Only 1/5 of the people that are self-tracking are using technology. This is a Californian-based research, so you always have to take this sort of into account where it is done, but it has some ideas. And you also see people with chronic conditions with a real need to measure do it much more often than the people that are just doing it for leisure purpose or for their own benefit. Because you'll see in the quantified self movements like this, a lot of people are really healthy and might not need it at all. Sharing, 2/3 of those who track don't share. There was a recent survey of the Quantified Self New York group. Little really did people share. I'm sharing a lot. I'm sharing my weight, my genetic profile and stuff like that, but that's a real small minority. Not a lot of people do that. But it does affect your health decisions. So a lot of people really do something with the data. They either take it to their doctor, they use it to inform themselves, so it can be a lot of reasons. You can also see it in the funding. So funding for digital health startups this quarter is 35% up from last year. So following that trend, we'll probably hit a first that it's actually going to be even bigger than the last year, and it's constantly growing, as you can see. And these are the categories. So remote patient monitoring, for one, is one of the biggest categories where investments happen. What things should you think of? Some of you might have heard of this movement before. Some of you are maybe doing a lot of self-tracking themselves, but these are things that are out there, actually things you can just buy at the Apple Store. A WeThink scale now includes a heart pressure monitor in the scale. When you step on it in the morning, it also actively measures your heartbeat, resting heartbeat, so you get an idea of your heartbeat combined with weight, fat mass, BMI, and so on. Fitbit is a step counter which you can use to measure activity levels, used in many sort of sports circumstances. Maybe you're recovering from surgery, anything else. different formats, different form factors. You'll see loads of these. They're also integrated in phones. They're not specifically unique devices anymore. Sleep monitoring, this is an interesting one as the company didn't make it through. They had an investment for years. They actually collapsed just a few weeks ago because apparently they couldn't make it happen in terms of building a sustainable company. But it monitors sleep. It has a headband as a form factor, which might or not might be reason why it didn't take off. But the data is quite interesting. This is a much more advanced measurement device, the body media, which has galvanic skin response, skin temperature, accelerometer. So all these data combined can give you a real insight. This is an interesting one. I have one with me for those of you who want to see it later on. This is actually a Lumo bag, and it also has an actuator. And that's an interesting thing. This is for lower back, people with lower back pain. So you actually tie it, and then it has your position, so whether you're standing, slouching, and then it can actuate on that, so it can give you a small buzz whenever you're sitting wrong. So when you're at your desk and you're actually sitting wrong, and maybe you have a hernia, or maybe you have some other ailments that you want to get rid of, this can actually help you actively while you're going about your day. Blood glucose meters are all around. So one little story how these experiments work. This is Sarah. You can't see it from this picture, but she has a specific kind of Parkinson's disease where she has small tremors. She measures that with a simple app from the iPhone, which actually allows her to tap in 30 seconds as much as possible on the screen. And then she plots these, how much she can tap in 30 seconds on a graph, and then she does it several times a day, several days, and then she actually adjusts her medicine use based on that data. So she can actually shift her medicines to another time of the day because she found out that tremors were more apparent in certain times of the day, and therefore that made her change her medicine regime. It doesn't have to be a really big, expensive technology. This is the Dutch thrombosis service. For those of you who might have experienced thrombosis themselves, grandparents and so on, this is a difficult service. People have to come to your home. They have to actually measure blood clot levels and such on. Now they actually teach people to do this themselves. So the device is not the sort of innovation, it's how they are delivering it. They are teaching people how to use this at home. So there is another innovation, which is the technology has been there for a long time, but it was always administered by professionals, and now it's been done by lay people. A Dutch startup, Delft, they're actually tying up with a mattress manufacturer, so they'll do a sleep analysis and then they'll advise you your best bed. This is a Dutch startup. One where you can actually have pills that you ingest and that can measure, for example, temperature in different parts of your body. There's an adhesive patch that you put on your body which actually picks up the pill as it goes through your tract or to your system, and then it can measure certain things. The interesting thing here, this will be commercially available. So this is not a device which you have to be prescribed by a doctor. You can actually go and buy. One of the companies, Avery Dennison, is a quite well-known label manufacturer which is doing this. Services exist where you can actually do, I heard Jack yesterday say, I think after the show, that we need more biomarkers. There are now services where you can at least, the known biomarkers that we have done easily. So you go there, you have blood drawn, and then it sends you back these results based on whatever markers you're interested in and whether you want to track them over a longer period of time or not. uBiome, Yuri just mentioned it. It's actually something that is built upon a Kickstarter platform where you can go fund it, and a lot of people have done that. They actually overshot their goal. This is a 14 by 2 millimeter sensor. The sensor is actually under the skin, and it can continuously do blood sample analysis. And with the 7 enzymes they've currently developed, this will allow you to, for example, see an onset of cardiac arrest coming up, because enzymes can be tied to certain factors in your blood that actually, based on the literature that's now available, indicate an oncoming heart attack, and therefore can actually warn you on time that it is happening. And there are other functions being built right now. One for your metabolism analysis, one that goes into your system, so you swallow this pill for. So there's lots of things. One you can actually use to detect breast cancer in an early stage. Breast cancer tumor growth is being said to be linked to temperature change, and therefore this bra, which measures temperature change in very small amounts, can actually help detect breast cancer. This is one that is helping people do the right measurements for analyzing breast cancer. You also have to be very skilled in knowing where to feel and where to see if there's certain lumps maybe or certain other things that are in the breast, and this is actually helping you by giving you feedback at that time. I'll go through a few slides which I won't go into because of time, but there's much about big data, but what I'm trying to get to, there's a lot of people who are actually, rightfully so, I think, critical to this movement. A lot of people say, why would you want to measure? What would you want to measure? So I'm just wanting to go through some of these sort of, in my views, things that we have to be very aware of in the quantified self movement and these things. And you can't do that, you can't let somebody else do that. That's why this is something which came out of one of the future mets. Data doesn't equal insight, insight doesn't equal value, forecasting is unreliable and implementation is hard. This is sort of the bottom line of what we're doing. It seems really simple, but really forecasting, really making something which is working all the time is really a hell of a job. And we need a lot of things that we don't have yet, which I'll come to in a minute. So the actuators, a lot of these devices are measuring, not actuating. And that's a sort of a big miss currently. I mean, there's a reason, it's step by step, but still we could use a lot more actuators in a sense that the measurements are also translated into action for the user and based maybe upon a device which takes into account other context factors. This is interesting. Thomas Goods, a well-known author of the decision tree, just transferred to the Atlantic and he's now entrepreneur in residence for the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. He wrote an article yesterday, it's called The Diabetes Paradox. I will advise any of you to read this because he's making a statement that actually this is not new. Diabetes patients have been doing measurements for 30 years, glucose measurements, and nobody likes it. Ultimately, measuring is no fun. Whatever you measure, however you measure, there is no fun in measuring. If you sort of go beyond that fact and think that measuring is inherently fun, it's probably either you're really enthusiastic for some other reason, but for probably the biggest part of the people in the world, this is still the way it is. It's not fun to measure. So there's a real hard nut to crack, if any, how do we make measurements actually fun to do? Owning and licensing your data is hard. How can you retract data that you've put in, for example, a bin where it's being used by others to be aggregated? Nike Fuel data, how do you get it back? How do you say I revoke my license to be in API terms? We haven't solved that yet. There's no current infrastructure which does that. This is an interesting one. If you look into sociological theories about health and digital health, self-qualification is one that is actually happening a lot in terms of, if you look to self-quantifiers who want to weigh X amount, say I want to weigh 80 kilos and I'm not getting there, I change the story. I say I want to be 83 kilos. That's a reachable goal. So we're reversing the story. A lot of self-qualification is happening where actually people talk about self-quantification. If you're not aware of it, it's hard to discern, but it's happening all the time. People change stories instead of change the numbers. The numbers are matched to the story you want to be. And that's something that is, if you want to really get to behavior change, something you need to take into account. It's not generalizable. If I have data, it doesn't mean that the data for you is the exact same data. It's not transferable immediately. If I walk, I might have different reasons why I walk. I have different ways of walking. Putting that all together and saying that it's a big hump of data which actually translates back to me, that's almost impossible if we do it in that way. You can't simply take all the data and say, this is the data which is the same. Walking is the same for everything. We need a lot more context. And that's what actually Malik, another article which I really advise, based on a larger data movement, wrote an excellent article about. Data needs a soul. If we talk about data and we don't see how it fits into a bigger context, why I'm going to that coffee shop every day, even though it's 2 miles out of my way, then we can't really say anything. So we need a lot more context of that. And so the last thing that I want to give you is an overview of these slides. I will put the slides up on SlideShare for those of you who want to see them. But this was the gist of my presentation. Thank you.
Great. Great. Amazing talk. Thanks for that. So we have a few minutes for questions. Anyone? No questions? Okay, I have a question. What do you think, if you extend this point of view, let's say 5 to 10 years, what is your personal view? Where are we? If you take into account the exponentials, the doubling of capacity, let's say every 18 months,
I think that there's going to be a lot more measuring going on, but without the knowing part. So I think measurements will take off. People will constantly measure. The only thing which is now happening all of the time is that measurements are linked. Like, I have a step counter and it's constantly showing me how many steps I've walked, and that might not be so interesting to me until I have a reason to know. And I think with the sort of abundance of sensors and other tools, it's becoming easier to measure, but this sort of psychological idea of where and when do you want to really know what is being measured, that can be sort of maybe put forward until you reach a doctor's visit. Maybe then you want to know, or maybe you just want to know the aggregate, or you want a monthly summary. So I think sensoring is in measuring will happen much more than we have it now, much more ubiquitous, less that we are aware of it, like in your boxer shorts, maybe electric current through elastical bands. There are many ways that you can actually integrate it in things you're already wearing. Either it's jewelry, food, or clothing, or similar things. But the knowing part is the difficult part. When and how do you want to actually be aware of what you're measuring? I think that's the difficult nut to crack, and that's not specifically technological.
Okay.
Question here.
If we have sound. Yeah.
Can you tell something about the way you work together with other sectors, for example, healthcare or consumer business? So it seems to be a separate movement, but maybe there's some integration or joint programs.
Yeah. Quantify itself as a movement includes a lot of different people from actually very many fields. It was by some compared to the homebrew computer clubs of like the 70s, because there's such an abundance of different types of people, researchers and all kinds. Working together with different sectors, especially, for example, in business, now proves a little bit hard in terms of making data actionable. So that's a difficult thing, making the data really say something. It's a long-term investment. So some of the long-term companies, for example, the ones that are backing Singularity, are also involved in this quantified self trend. But the interesting thing is it's really powered from the user's perspective. So people are doing it, and they have to sort of go from the bottom up to these institutions, and sometimes they might not even need that. So that's why there's sometimes a difficult relationship, because companies are actually really, most of the time when I talk to them, not aware of this happening. But on the other side, there are foundations such as the Wireless Life Sciences Alliance. Pepsi is one of the companies which recently joined. Pepsi sees value in the fact that we can actually all the time maybe get feedback on either what we ingest or what we drink and so on. So they are building up this relationship, but I think it's hard to discern in most of the public sort of announcement that we see today. So that will maybe take a little longer.
Thank you. Great.